there has also been an element of political cover from some on the left and within the Labour Party to the marchers and to others. And the question of how the government has responded to those marches has only contributed to the Jewish community feeling less safe.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm the Spectator's political editor, Tim Shipman, and today I'm joined by the editor, Michael Gove. And we're going to talk about the appalling events at Heaton Park Synagogue in Manchester, where 2 people are dead, others are in hospital. Michael, what do you make of this? What does this tell us about British society today, about the threat that the Jewish community is feeling, about the realities of what appears to be an Islamist terrorist incident, and how the governing class is responding to that?
Well, the first thing is that while the news is horrendous and shocking, I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone in the Jewish community. For months now, Jewish community organisations have been warning about the rising tide of antisemitism, the increasingly physical nature of the way in which threats are manifesting themselves. We've had feces dubbed on synagogues in the past. We have Jewish individuals who deliberately ensure that when they're out and about in the city, whether it's London, Manchester, Glasgow or elsewhere, that they're not displaying anything, whether it's a skull cap, a kippah, or whether it's a Star of David as an item of jewellery, which might identify them as Jewish. So amongst the Jewish community, there is a sense of horror, not least because it's a direct attack on a place of worship on the holiest day in Judaism. But there's also a sense that warnings had been issued and not heeded.
And bluntly, that it could have been a lot worse if the community had not been kind of aware of these kind of threats. I mean, we saw people, they've got some security of their own. Some people seem to have been completely heroic in sort of barricading the door and stopping this guy getting in. And had he done so, it's possible to see that the loss of life might have been much higher.
Well, quite. And the Jewish community funds a charity, the Community Security Trust, which does also receive some funding from government as well, which is made up of volunteers. And they are outside every synagogue and every Jewish school in the country. And one of the questions that the community have asked, not just in the wake of this, but beforehand, is why is it that they have to fund and provide their own security in these circumstances when, for example, at, say, the Notting Hill Carnival or any other communal event, the police are there in numbers in order to ensure everyone's safety? And the Home Secretary has said that she's going to review the way in which the Community Security Trust is supported. It has to be said that even though now we know that one of the victims was one of the 2 people who died was shot by the police in an effort to neutralise the terrorist, that the general consensus is that the police, by reacting so speedily to this genuine terrorist attack, which could potentially have been much worse, behaved creditably. But there will be broader questions about policing. And, of course, the deeper question is not so much how you can prevent an attack when it's about to take place, but how can you track and prevent further upstream the sort of person who might be responsible for an attack like this and the sort of people who will be supporting them.
There's 2 things there, aren't there? So there's the current political context in which this has taken place, because there's the astonishing sight of protests on the streets in Manchester, as well as London and other places, pro-Palestinian protests at precisely the moment that this was happening and afterwards. And then there's also the issue of the perpetrator, who appears not to have been on the radar of the security services in any meaningful way. What's your impression of the government's reaction to all of this? I mean, they've said more money for the CST potentially, stepping up security themselves, presumably getting the police to do more. But how is that compatible, do you think, with the protests that should have been going on, which surely have, do you agree, have fueled some kind of context for which this sort of action is more likely?
Undoubtedly. I mean, it's almost too obvious to say, but it's still necessary to say that some of the people who will have been on protests will be people who will be motivated by the most pure humanitarian motives, of course. But the marches that have taken place, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign marches that have taken place for 2 years now, have attracted people who have been saying the most grotesque things, who've been making an equation between Israel, Jews, and Nazism, and whose rhetoric has been inflammatory, to put it mildly. One of the inevitable questions that I have to ask is, it's entirely understandable that one might have wanted to go on one of those marches earlier, but having seen the type of people who are organising them and having seen the other people on those marches, would you really want to be associated with that? This Saturday, there is due to be an event in London, in Westminster, organised by Defend Our Juries, which is essentially a front organisation that supports Palestine Action, which is a prescribed group. The government have prescribed it. The government would say that they have to allow peaceful protest. They would say that, of course, they've prescribed Palestine Action as a terrorist group. I think it's undoubtedly the case that there are people within government who are aware of the nature and the seriousness of the threat. But part of the challenge is that even as there is this awareness, there has also been an element of political cover from some on the left and within the Labour Party to the marchers and to others. And the question of how the government has responded to those marches has only contributed to the Jewish community feeling less safe. And a case in point is that just a month ago I joined a march against anti-Semitism. Again, it was, of course, entirely peaceful, but there was no government representative there. There was no one to respond to the concerns being expressed by the community. And it's almost as though within the Jewish community there's a sense that the numbers on the streets and behind the Palestine Solidarity Campaign marches have intimidated the government, intimidated them into recognising Palestine, and intimidated them into not being sufficiently aware of the connection between the rhetoric of these marches and a broader atmosphere of hate.
And do you think Labour still has a particular problem with this? I mean, when Keir Starmer took over, he was very keen, almost the first thing he said as leader of the Labour Party was to condemn the sort of rampant anti-Semitism that had gripped the party under Jeremy Corbyn. There were expulsions, there were sort of demonstrative displays of support for the Jewish community. But one of our fellow commentators, Dan Hodges, had to say yesterday that, well, I'm sure the government feels this and cares about it, but it won't do what it needs to do because of its own electoral position. Is that something that you think has something in it?
Yes, I think it is true. One has to be careful about all of the individuals who are exercising responsibility at a moment like this, because they will have access to some information, I know from having been in government myself, that can't be shared. But there are certain things that can be said. The first thing is I do think that Keir Starmer, in his heart, is sincerely horrified by this and wants to take action. Not just because his wife is Jewish, but because he recognises that the poison of anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn was ultimately contaminating politics and rendered Labour unfit for government. But it's also the case that at the last general election, Labour lost seats to candidates who were explicitly attacking Labour for being insufficiently attentive to the concerns of the most strident and most extreme voices within the Muslim community. And it's the case that two cabinet ministers, the Home Secretary herself and the Health Secretary, came within a breadth of losing their seats. And Jess Phillips, the Home Office Minister responsible for safeguarding, came very close to losing her seat. There are other seats under threat as well. So given the sense of public anger amongst many people within the Muslim community and beyond it about the situation in Israel, a judgment has been made, and I'm sure it's partly political, to recognise the Palestinian state. That's been welcomed, of course, internationally by some diplomats, but it's certainly been welcomed by Hamas, who said that this is a vindication for their actions. And two things flow from that. One is that there will be people who see that violence appears to bring results. The government will contest that, but that is how it will be seen. And the second thing is that in a judgment about how to defend minorities who feel aggrieved or alienated, that the Labour government is making a judgment on the basis of numbers, not the quality of the argument. There is a real sense that it's because of electoral pressure that decisions are being made on the conflict in the Middle East, not on its intrinsic merits.
And in terms of the spread of anti-Semitism and what appears to be, generally speaking, a high proportion of incidents like this coming from perpetrators with an Islamist background, is this simply a demographic issue, that there are a lot of Muslim people in Britain now, and some of whom have views that are outside what used to be the political mainstream?
I don't think it's simply a demographic issue, because we've had this problem for some time. And I wrote a book, a study of some of the ideological roots of Islamist extremism 20 years ago. And of course, we remember that it was 20 years ago that we had the 7/7 bombings, and even before that, there were Islamist terror threats in Britain. One of the other things that I drew attention to then, which is marked as well, is the fact that you'll have people on the extreme left, Socialist Worker Party adjacent and so on, who exercise a sneaking regard for Islamist ideology. And so you have this sort of hard left Islamist, if not alliance, certainly a coincidence of interests, a sort of rainbow crescent coming together. And that group, or those groups, have been emboldened over time. And again, sorry to be autobiographical, but when I was in government, one of the things that I wanted us to do was to concentrate not just on violent extremism, but extremism overall. There's huge resistance to that. But I think unless you look at
You had a huge ding-dong with the Home Office, if I
massive.
remember rightly.
Yeah, several. But unless you look at the ideological reasons why people do what they do, then you're not looking at the full picture.
And do you think society has been naive about that over the years?
Yes, I think that no analogy is perfect, but when we had concerns about communism and the external and internal threat that it posed to our democracy in the Cold War, everyone would have known who was engaged in that debate. Marx, Lenin, Stalin, what they wrote, what they thought, what the argument of communism was. But if I were to talk about Al-Banna, Qutb, and Maududi, who are the three essential thinkers behind Islamism, the idea that Islam is not just a religion but a complete political system that should cover the globe, most people, and this is the terrifying thing, a significant number of people in government wouldn't know what you were talking about. And one of my areas of exasperation is that people who were charged with keeping us safe didn't have a Scooby about the ideological motivation and justification of the people who wished us harm. And I fear that unless there's an effort by the government now to grapple upstream, as I say, with some of these factors, then we're only dealing with part of the picture. And there is a lot of additional detailed work that needs to be done, for example, in our prisons to stop radicalization there. But the only way in which you can stop that is if you know the difference between someone who is, a criminal, but a pious Muslim who wants to follow their faith in incarceration, and then those people who are actively seeking either to spread or to recruit a message of hate and to win new people to violence.
I mean, is there not a case that this is not just a matter for government, but for sort of the educational establishment as well? I mean, I remember, I studied extremism in various forms. I did Arab nationalism, but I don't. My knowledge of Sayyid Qutb comes from a documentary that Adam Curtis made about 20 years ago, which had some Brian Eno music on it. And I went and looked into him then, but I never learnt that.
No, I think that there is a case for wider understanding in civil society. And again, one of the things that I thought was appropriate is that at local government level, people should know, so that you could tell the difference when people were applying for government grants or applying to use public buildings between people who might be very conservative in their religious belief from the Muslim or other communities. You might not agree with their beliefs, but they were people who were living happily within British democracy. And then those people who had either an open or cloaked extremist intent. So I think there does need to be that wider understanding, and also a wider understanding as well of the way in which anti-Semitism has increasingly fastened on Israel and the existence of a Jewish state as an outlet for the oldest hatred, which has taken new forms. Again, one always has to draw this distinction that it's perfectly legitimate, indeed sometimes necessary, to criticize the government of Israel for its actions. But when you see the disproportionate way in which Israel is singled out for criticism, and when you see some of the things that are said, then you can tell that it's being driven by a desire to say that Israel, unique amongst countries in the globe, shouldn't exist.
I mean, I think any reform supporters watching this would be crying out for me to say, but Mr. Gove, you're part of a government that dramatically increased migration, and that a lot of it came from countries in the subcontinent. There's a lot of people come from Kashmir and from places, Bangladesh and places like that, where there's a disproportionate number of Muslims and a disproportionate number of people in those communities that seems to have, they were linked with the grooming gangs.
Yes.
We now see, situations like this. I mean, this character doesn't seem to have come from that part of the world. But I think to what degree can you make a migration policy about where people are from and what they think? Because Donald Trump has shown that it's possible to do that, but when he did so, it caused absolute outrage in this country.
Yeah, no, I think that every government should have a right to draw up rules and enforce them on who can come to the country, which country they can originate from, and why. Absolutely. But it's not simply a question of migration. And that might seem as though I'm dodging the question. Of course, there were mistakes that were made on migration policy. But it's also the case that you can have people who come from Muslim countries who can integrate successfully into the United Kingdom. And it's also the case that it's often people from within Muslim communities who are the targets of extremism. So the Ahmadiyya community, Muslim community that looks to the Aga Khan for leadership, is regarded by hardline Islamists as apostate and therefore illegitimate target. And so my plea is for better understanding, not in a kumbaya way, because better understanding, I think you're right, would mean that we would look carefully at people who might be coming from Afghanistan, from Kashmir, from parts of Bangladesh, from other parts of the Muslim world. And we'd look carefully in particular at imams and thinkers who may be responsible for spreading this ideology. But I think it means looking at it with a greater degree of care, attention, and interest, and then also working with some of the Arab and Muslim countries that themselves are trying to deal with this problem. So the United Arab Emirates, for example, has banned the Muslim Brotherhood. It is anxious to work with countries in the West to raise our awareness of it, and there are people who are engaged in anti-extremism work on the ground in the Arab-Muslim Middle East who are just as concerned as we are and just as determined to fight it.
What then do we do here? This chap doesn't seem to have been on the radar of the prevent strategy and the other things that are in place to try and monitor people with apparently extreme positions. What can be done to improve that? Often in the past, we have seen that people were in some way, had been part of prevent or dropped out of it, or were being monitored by the security services but hadn't yet done enough to warrant them being brought in, and they then go on and commit these offences. What could be done to improve that monitoring and that system in general? Well,
William Shawcross conducted a review of the Prevent programme. He was asked to do so by the last government. And he made the point, which I think was quite right, that you had absurd situations whereby people who might have liked Jacob Rees-Mogg's articles, or who might have been drawn towards the works of right-wing historians, were at risk of radicalisation. And there wasn't a proper systematic way of identifying the types of people who were really at risk and getting to grips with the types of ideologies and the people who spread them that really foment hate. And I don't believe that William's report has been properly implemented. And I think it's also the case that since the government's come to power, there hasn't been a proper counter-extremism strategy or overhaul of the counter-extremism strategy for many years. So there is an opportunity to do that, and part of it is an acknowledgement that you cannot, particularly in a world when so many people are influenced by what they read and digest online, identify every potential terrorist, but what you can do is you can drain as much of the swamp as possible.
And how do you make those definitions, though? I mean, we're in this long-running debate about free speech at the moment. The government was trying to draw up a sort of Islamophobia definition. Labour was in absolute knots under Corbyn in trying to, decide whether to accept the international definition of Islamophobia or not. A lot of people still don't seem to accept that because it does conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. So, how do you remain a free and tolerant society whilst dealing with views that do not, frankly, support a free and tolerant society?
It's uniquely difficult. At the Spectator, for example, we've said in the past that NECAP, the Irish Republican band, should be allowed to play, that even though their views are offensive, that you shouldn't ban artists or you shouldn't restrict speech simply because you find it offensive. But I think that there can be broader public pressure. The Home Secretary herself made the point that she thought that last night's marches were by the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign in the aftermath of the synagogue killings were misplaced. That can definitely play
un-British, I think she said.
Quite right. I think she's absolutely right on that. In addition, I think it's the case that we can say that there are certain organisations which can continue to exist. We wouldn't necessarily proscribe them, but we can say that we can call them out for being extremist. We can say they should not receive government money. We should say that they should not be given public platforms where they're using local government resources or anything like that. And people can know. The Prime Minister, I don't want to get too much into party politics, but the Prime Minister made it clear in his party conference speech that he thought that it was right to call out his political opponents or some of his political opponents, I should say, for being beyond the pale. That has an effect. It galvanises debate. It should certainly be the case that not just the Prime Minister from a conference speech, but government and its institutions should be clear about the type of rhetoric and the type of people who need to be taken head on. And in particular, I think it needs to be made clear that it's not all about Israel, but that the criticism of Israel that is mounted by so many people is in itself anti-Semitic and encourages this sort of violence.
Because he seems happy to call out, what he would call the far right and call them racist, but there seems to be a broad reluctance in the sort of public sphere to call out extremist Islamists as being what they are.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem around whether or not a definition of Islamophobia can be shaped. It's undeniably the case that there's been an increase in anti-Muslim hatred on our streets, but a definition of Islamophobia would be very difficult because it goes on to questions of faith and extremism. And as a number of people have pointed out, it would make it much more difficult, would have made it more difficult to investigate and report on the grooming gang scandal. So that is problematic. And it is also the case, for example, that we have these guys in the House of Commons who are in the so-called Gaza independents. As far as I can tell, some of the things that they've said, some of the causes that they've supported, some of the actions of their supporters do deserve to be called out, and you have to ask the question of some of the people who are endorsing them, what you're doing, and also I think it was quite right for Zach Polanski, the leader of the Green Party, to be taken to task about what his deputy had said in this context, and I think that there does need to be a clear point made that the rising tide of anti-Semitism is not restricted to Islamists, but you can't ignore it.
Are you in any way optimistic about the future then, in terms of the Jewish community feeling less alienated, the potential terrorists being dealt with?
Optimistic, but I do believe that there are people in government, in Parliament, in the intelligence and security services and elsewhere who do understand the scale of the problem and are capable of responding appropriately. But it's the job of those of us who've got any sort of platform or who engaged in commentary to try to get them to take this issue not just with the seriousness it deserves, but to show that they are quarrying the expertise and applying the techniques that those who are most determined to deal with this problem have been asking them to follow for years now.
Because the death of Charlie Kirk in America did seem to be a watershed moment for some of the debates there. Do you think in some way that this can have the effect here? And it's the Conservative Party conference this weekend. What should Kemi Badenoch be saying about this?
Well, I wouldn't want to put words in Kemi's mouth. And to be fair to the Conservative Party, at the rally against anti-Semitism, Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, was the most senior politician there. And Kemi Badenoch has been very, very, very clear in her analysis of the problems that extremism generate. Again, it's not a matter of party political judgment, but I do think that on this, some people would say this, but I think it is clear that Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party have been the clearest of all in outlining where the problems lie, but more broadly in our politics and in the response of government. I would hope that appropriate lessons would be drawn. The difficulty, however, is that after October the 7th, there was a natural outpouring of public sympathy, but even then, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign were planning an anti-Israel march within hours of that atrocity taking place. And 20 years ago, after 7/7, Tony Blair said the rules of the game had changed. And while there have been some successes in the hard end of counter-terror, the broader battle against extremism still hasn't been engaged in properly.
Well, on that somewhat bleak note, we'll say thank you to Michael, and thank you very much for tuning in.